The night hung heavy outside the convenience store, the air thick with an unspoken tension that seemed to cling to everything. The cracked pavement, the flickering streetlights, the faint hum of traffic in the distance. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glow across the worn tiles and dusty shelves. The store sat like a tired relic, sandwiched between a laundromat with a perpetually broken dryer and a barber shop whose red and white pole hadn't spun in over a decade. The faint scent of bleach mingled uneasily with the stale aroma of reheated burritos, a smell that stuck to the back of your throat and lingered like a bad memory. Darius Cole stood near the counter, his tall frame filling the space with a quiet, unshakable presence. At 6'2", with broad shoulders and a lean build, he carried himself with the kind of confidence that didn't need to shout, it just was. His dark brown skin stood out against the deep navy of his button-up shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms etched with the subtle strength of a man who'd fought his way through life and come out on top. His face was striking sharp jawline, deep-set eyes that held a world of thoughts, and a faint crease in his brow that suggested he was always analyzing, always watching. Tonight, though, his expression was softer, distracted even, as he tapped his fingers lightly against a plastic water bottle, waiting for the cashier to finish fumbling with his change. He'd grown up just a few streets over, in a neighborhood that wore its scars, proud lipophils in the roads, graffiti on the walls, houses with sagging porches and peeling paint. As a kid, he'd zipped through those streets on a beat-up bike, dodging broken glass and dreaming of something bigger. Back then, the world had seemed endless, brimming with potential. Now, it felt smaller, heavier, weighed down by time and the slow grind of decay. Darius had escaped, through college, the military, and finally a career as an FBI agent. He'd clawed his way up, refusing to let anyone box him in because of where he'd come from or how he looked. But no matter how far he climbed, there were nights like this, when the past reached out and dragged him back, reminding him that some things never changed. The cashier, a skinny kid with a face full of acne and nails chewed down to the quick slide a few coins across the counter, avoiding Darius's gaze. "Have a good night," Darius said, his voice steady and warm, the kind of tone that invited a response. The kid just mumbled something incoherent and turned away, already lost in his own world. Darius sighed softly, tucking the change into his wallet. It wasn't personal, he knew that. People around here were just tired, worn thin by life. He'd seen it growing up, felt it himself. Shrugging it off, he turned toward the door, his mind already drifting to the quiet evening he'd planned. Until he caught sight of the police car, rolling up outside. The vehicle slowed to a stop with an eerie precision, its lights off but its presence loud. Darius's instincts kicked in, a prickle of unease crawling up his spine. He paused, hand hovering near the door, watching as Officer Bradley Hart stepped out. Bradley was a squat, sturdy man, his blonde hair cropped close to his scalp, his pale skin perpetually flushed with a simmering anger that seemed to radiate off him. He wasn't tall, but he carried himself like he was, shoulders squared and chest puffed out, his uniform crisp despite the late hour. Bradley had been patrolling these streets for years, too many, some might say, not out of love for the place, but something else, something harder and uglier. His eyes, small and sharp, locked onto Darius through the glass door, and in that moment, Darius knew this wasn't just a routine stop. "Get your hands up, now," the command ripped through the stillness like a gunshot. Bradley's voice harsh and unyielding as he stormed inside, his boots thudding against the tile. Darius froze, his breath catching in his chest, hands lifting instinctively as the flashing red and blue lights from the cruiser outside spilled through the windows, painting his face in jagged streaks of color. His heart thudded, not out of fear yet but out of a sudden, jarring confusion. The weight of Bradley's stare hit him harder than the words, those eyes burning with a mix of contempt and something darker, something personal. Darius stood near the counter, his wallet still open from paying for a pack of gum and a bottle of water. The receipt was still warm in his hand, the cashier's shaky fingers having just pressed it into his palm moments before. Now, that same cashier boy who couldn't have been more than 17 stumbled back a step, his wide eyes darting between Darius and the gun trembling in Bradley's hand. The officer's finger hovered too close to the trigger, a twitch away from disaster. And the air in the store thickened, every sound amplified the hum of the lights, the faint crackle of Bradley's radio, the shallow breathing of the handful of customers who'd frozen in place. "What's going on?" Darius asked, keeping his voice level despite the storm brewing inside him. His mind raced, piecing together the scene, but nothing fit. He'd done nothing but walk in, pay, and turn to leave. Bradley's lip curled, a snarl forming as he barked, "Shut up." I said, "Hands up, don't move a damn muscle." The authority in his tone was unmistakable, but beneath it lurked something venomous, a bitterness that felt like it had been simmering for years, waiting for a target. Darius complied, his hands steady in the air, but his eyes flicked to the gun, then to Bradley's face-clenched jaw, flushed cheeks, a man on the edge. "Step away from the counter," Bradley ordered, his voice cutting sharper now. "Do it." Darius hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of defiance, but because the absurdity of it all was sinking in. Then he moved, slow and deliberate, stepping back from the counter, his sneakers scuffing softly against the tile. "What did I do?" he asked, his tone calm but laced with a growing edge, a knot tightening in his throat. Bradley's sneer deepened. "Don't play dumb. You look suspicious as hell. Strolling around here like you own the place. Got a report about a robbery suspectal, black, cocky enough to think he can get away with it." The words landed like a punch, each one dripping with accusation, with assumptions Darius had heard 1,000 times before. Robbery? He almost laughed. The idea was so ridiculous, but the gun in Bradley's hand kept the sound trapped in his chest. "Are you kidding me?" he said instead, incredulity seeping through. Don't talk back," Bradley snapped, stepping closer, his badge catching the light and gleaming like a taunt. "Where's your ID?" Darius swallowed, forcing himself to stay steady. "It's in my pocket," he said slowly. "I'm reaching for it." But before his hand could move an inch, Bradley lunged, grabbing his arm with a grip like iron and slamming him face first against the counter. The impact stole the air from his lungs, his cheek pressed hard against the cold glass, the edge of the counter digging into his ribs. His wallet slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor with a soft thud, and for a fleeting moment, the glint of his FBI badge flashed as it flipped open shiny, unmistakable before snapping shut again. Bradley didn't see it. He was too busy snarling, "Don't resist me," as he yanked Darius's arm behind his back, twisting until his shoulders screamed in protest. "I'm not resisting," Darius managed, his voice tight, teeth gritted against the pain. But Bradley wasn't listening. He leaned in close, his breath hot and sour against Darius's ear. "What's the matter? Not so tough now, huh? Thought you could waltz in here and take whatever you wanted." The words were a venomous hiss, laced with a satisfaction that made Darius's stomach turn. "That's not what happened," he shot back, the pressure on his arm intensifying. But he refused to let his voice waver. The store had fallen deathly silent, save for the faint crackle of Bradley's radio and the shallow, panicked breaths of the cashier, who stood rooted behind the counter, hands trembling. A woman near the candy aisle clutched her purse tighter, her eyes wide with fear not of Darius, but of the chaos unfolding. An older man by the coffee machine shifted uncomfortably, his weathered face creased with unease, as if he'd seen this play out too many times before. "You're making a mistake," Darius said, his voice low and sharp now, cutting through the tension. Bradley scoffed, his grip tightening. "The only mistake was thinking you could walk into my neighborhood and not get caught." The words dripped with possession, with a twisted sense of power, and Darius felt a flash of anger surge through him, hot and familiar. He'd been here before, profiled, judged, reduced to a stereotype by men like Bradley, who hid behind their badges like shields. But tonight, it hit harder, the weight of years of injustice pressing down until he could barely breathe. "Look closer at my wallet," Darius said, his tone steady but edged with steel. Bradley paused, his breath hitching for a split second, but he didn't let go. Instead, he bent down, snatched the wallet off the floor, and flipped it open with a rough jerk. The silence that followed was deafening. The FBI badge stared up at him, gleaming under the harsh lights, a truth Bradley couldn't ignore. His grip faltered, his fingers loosening as his eyes darted from the badge to Darius's face. "You're lying," he muttered, but the conviction was gone, replaced by a flicker of doubt, then fear. "No," Darius said, straightening as Bradley stumbled back a step. "I'm not." He rolled his shoulder, wincing at the ache, but his gaze never wavered. The moment should have brought relief, a small victory, but instead, it ignited something darker, deep, simmering rage. Bradley's expression shifted, fear giving way to defiance, his jaw tightening. "Don't think this changes anything," he snapped, clinging to his authority like a lifeline. "Oh, it changes everything," Darius replied, his voice calm, but laced with a quiet fury that promised consequences. He could feel the eyes of the cashier, the customers, all watching, waiting. The humiliation still burned, the anger still pulsed, but beneath it all was a clarity. This wasn't over. Justice wasn't just a badge or a law, it was what happened when power was turned back on itself. When the truth stripped away the lies men like Bradley hid behind. And what came next? That would be a reckoning that would leave Bradley and everyone else in that store reeling in its wake. Because Darius Cole wasn't just a man wronged, he was a force, and the fallout was going to shake this tired little corner of the world to its core. Bradley's heart thrived on the intoxicating rush of power surging through his veins. He savored the metallic tang of fear that clung to the air whenever he entered a room. But above all, he relished the cruel satisfaction of shrinking people like Darius down to nothing with a single glare. Darius, on the other hand, had crossed paths with men cut from the same cloth as Bradley before, those who draped their authority round them like a heavy, impenetrable cloak, wielding their badges not as shields of justice, but as blunt instruments of control. Yet, until this fateful moment, their worlds had never collided. As Darius pushed open the glass door of the dimly lit convenience store, Bradley's piercing gaze latched onto him instantly, a predator sizing up its prey. The air grew thick, charged with an unspoken challenge. "Hey, you!" Bradley's voice sliced through the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Darius froze, his fingers still curled around the cool metal of the door handle. A flicker of irritation sparking deep within him, he turned his head slightly, meeting Bradley's stare. "Yeah, you," Bradley barked again, jabbing a finger in his direction. "Step away from the door." Darius pivoted slowly, deliberately, his movements measured as he assessed the man before him. Bradley stood tall, his chest puffed out beneath the crisp lines of his uniform, his eyes glinting with a dangerous mix of arrogance and suspicion. "Is there a problem?" Darius asked, his tone calm but edged with a quiet defiance he couldn't quite suppress. "You tell me," Bradley shot back, his eyes narrowing into slits as he took a step closer. "You look like you're in a hurry to get out of here." His voice carried the weight of an accusation, as though Darius's mere presence in the store was a crime in itself. Darius arched an eyebrow, his lips twitching with the faintest hint of incredulity. "I bought a bottle of water and some gum," he said evenly, gesturing toward the counter where his purchases sat in a flimsy plastic bag. "That's hardly suspicious," but Bradley's jaw tightened, his face hardening as if Darius's words were a personal affront. The officer's hands flexed at his sides, itching for a reason to escalate. "Hands where I can see them," Bradley ordered, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. The tension in the cramped store thickened like a gathering storm. Darius's eyes darted around briefly, taking in the scene. The cashier behind the counter gaped at them, her wide eyes reflecting the fluorescent glare, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the register. Nearby, a woman clutching a gallon of milk stood rooted by the refrigerators, her knuckles white around the plastic handle as though it might somehow shield her from the unfolding confrontation. Darius exhaled slowly, forcing his rising anger down as he raised his hands, palms open, in a gesture of compliance. "Seriously," he muttered under his breath, the words slipping out before he could stop it. "Don't talk," Bradley snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "Just step away from the counter." Darius swallowed hard, the sharp retort burning on his tongue like acid. He'd been here before too many times, navigating the tightrope of staying calm, steady, non-threatening. That's what they always told you, don't give them a reason. But there was something in Bradley's tone, a jagged edge of malice gleaming in his eyes, that set Darius's blood simmering beneath his skin. "Look," Darius said carefully, each word chosen with precision. "I'm reaching for my wallet to show you my ID. That's all." He kept his movements slow, deliberate, telegraphing every intention to avoid misinterpretation. "Don't move," Bradley barked, lunging forward with startling speed. Darius froze, his breath catching in his chest as Bradley loomed closer. "On your knees," the officer commanded, his voice booming through the store. "Excuse me," Darius's voice rose slightly, disbelief warring with the humiliation clawing at his gut. "You heard me, on your knees, now." Bradley's eyes blazed with a feverish intensity, his chest heaving as though he were feeding off the moment. Darius's heart pounded against his ribs, a furious rhythm that echoed the injustice sinking its teeth into him. Every fiber of his being screamed to resist, to push back against this absurdity. But he bit down hard on the inside of his cheek, tasting the metallic tang of restraint. This wasn't necessary. Onion with eyes could see that, but Bradley didn't care about necessity. He cared about dominance. "You think you get to decide what's necessary," Bradley sneered, his lips curling into a cruel smirk as he towered over Darius. Darius's jaw clenched so tightly he thought his teeth might crack, but he held his ground, refusing to let the humiliation break him. "Get down," Bradley roared, and before Darius could react, the officer's hands slammed into his chest with brutal force. The impact sent him stumbling backward, his hip crashing into the edge of the counter. A display of candy bars toppled to the floor in a chaotic cascade of wrappers, the sound sharp and jarring in the tense silence. His wallet slipped from his grasp, hitting the linoleum with a soft, anticlimactic thud. Bradley was on him in an instant, seizing his arm and twisting it behind his back with a vicious yank that made Darius grit his teeth against the pain. "You think you're tough, huh?" Bradley hissed, his breath hot against Darius's ear as he tightened his grip. Darius's vision flared red, his body straining against the hold. "Get off me," he snapped, twisting to break free. But Bradley's strength, or perhaps his sheer determination, held firm. "You don't belong here," Bradley growled, the words dripping with venom, each syllable a dagger aimed at Darius's core. That was the spark that ignited something primal within him. Not belong, after everything he'd fought for, everything he'd earned through sweat and grit and unrelenting will. This petty tyrant dared to reduce him to nothing. The anger surged hot and blinding, but then, in a fleeting heartbeat, the air shifted. Bradley's grip faltered, just for a fraction of a second, as though some unseen force had brushed against him. Darius seized the moment. "You might want to check that wallet you just knocked out of my hands," he said, his voice cutting through the haze like a blade, sharp and steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Bradley hesitated, his brows knitting together in confusion. "What?" he muttered, the word barely audible. "My wallet," Darius repeated, his tone hardening with cold clarity. "Pick it up." Bradley's movements were reluctant, his fingers trembling slightly as he bent to retrieve the slim leather fold from the floor. The moment his eyes landed on the gleaming gold FBI badge nestled inside, the color drained from his face as though someone had pulled a plug deep within him. His bravado crumbled, replaced by a raw, unmasked uncertainty that flickered across his features like a dying flame. For the first time that night, Bradley's heart looked small, diminished in a way he'd never imagined possible. "Is this some kind of joke?" he barked, but his voice cracked, betraying the panic clawing its way up his throat. Darius didn't flinch. He straightened his posture, shoulders squaring as he took a slow, deliberate step forward, his gaze locking onto Bradley's with an intensity that made the officer's stomach twist into knots. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Darius replied, his voice low and resonant, carrying the weight of a man who'd just turned the tables. Bradley's eyes flickered nervously to the cashier, who stood frozen behind the counter, her breath shallow, then back to Darius. His grip on the wallet tightened, his knuckles whitening as if he could crush the damning evidence and erase the reality staring him in the face. "You assaulted me," Darius continued, his words deliberate, each one landing like a hammer on steel. "You put your hands on me, humiliated me in front of everyone here, and made it crystal clear you think people like me don't belong. So go ahead, say it's a joke. See where that gets you." Watch your tone, Bradley snapped, his voice rising in a desperate bid to reclaim the authority slipping through his fingers like sand. But it was too late. Darius's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, not warm, not triumphant, but cold and knowing, a silent acknowledgement of the shift in power. "Aren't I in control here?" Darius asked, his voice soft but unyielding, a quiet challenge that hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Bradley's jaw clenched, his nostrils flaring as he struggled to find a foothold in the quicksand of his own making. For a long, suffocating moment, neither man moved, the tension coiling tighter until it felt like the room itself might shatter under the pressure. Then, abruptly, Bradley turned on his heel, his boots squeaking against the linoleum as he strode toward the door with hurried, uneven steps. "Where do you think you're going?" Darius's voice cut through the silence, sharp and unyielding, stopping Bradley dead in his tracks. The officer's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't turn around, his hand hovering over the door handle as though debating whether to flee or face the consequences. "You think you can walk out of here and pretend this didn't happen?" Darius pressed, taking another measured step closer. "That you can sweep this under the rug like every other time? You've thrown your weight around in this neighborhood." His words were a slow burn, each one stoking the fire of Bradley's unraveling composure. Finally, Bradley whirled around, his face pale but his eyes blazing with defiance. "You have no idea who you're messing with," he spat through gritted teeth, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and fury. "No," Darius countered, his tone steady and resolute. "You have no idea who you just messed with." The words landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the store with a weight that left no room for doubt. Bradley's breath hitched, his bravado faltering as he shoved the wallet back into Darius's hands with a shaky thrust. "This isn't over," he snarled, his voice quaking as he pushed past Darius and stormed out into the night, the bell above the door jangling wildly in his wake. Darius didn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins like wildfire, his chest rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. He knew men like Bradley didn't slink away quietly. If anything, this encounter had lit a match under the officer's fragile ego, and that flicker of unease gnawed at Darius's gut. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something far messier. The next morning, Darius sat in his car outside the FBI field office, the steering wheel cool against his palms as he gripped it with white-knuckled intensity. The confrontation replayed in his mind on an endless loop. Bradley's sneering face, the crack in his voice as his confidence shattered, the venom that had dripped from his every word. Darius had faced bigotry before too many times to count it. Bradley wasn't just another loudmouth with a badge. There was a reckless edge to him, a hunger for control that made him dangerous. Something about the night before felt unresolved, like a storm cloud hovering just out of sight, waiting to break. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, jolting him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen, Special Agent Mitchell Gray, his boss, with a steadying breath. Darius answered. "Agent Cole," Gray's voice boomed through the speaker, authoritative and clipped. "Got a minute?" "Sure," Darius replied, masking the unease simmering beneath his composed exterior. "Come up to my office. We need to talk." The line went dead, and Darius felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Stepping into Gray's office felt like walking into a lion's den. The room was stark and functional, its walls lined with commendations and framed photos of a career built on discipline and grit. Gray sat behind his desk, an older man with graying hair and a sharp suit that seemed to embody his no-nonsense demeanor. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Darius as he motioned to the chair across from him. "Sit down," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. Darius obeyed, settling into the seat with a measured calm he didn't entirely feel. Gray leaned forward, lacing his fingers together atop a stack of files. "I got a call this morning," he began, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of gravity. "From the local police department. They said one of their officers had an incident with you last night. Officer Bradley Hart." Darius held Gray's gaze, his face a mask of neutrality even as his stomach lurched. "That's one way to describe it," he said, his voice low and even. "Is it true?" Gray pressed, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Did he physically assault you?" Yes, Darius answered without hesitation, the word sharp and unapologetic. Gray exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples with a weariness that hinted at the battles he'd fought both in the field. And behind this desk, do you want to press charges? He asked, the question hanging heavy in the air between them. Darius leaned back slightly, his mind racing as he weighed the implications. Pressing charge is meant dragging Bradley into the light, exposing his abuse of power for all to see an act of justice. That could ripple far beyond this single moment, but it also meant thrusting himself into the spotlight, inviting scrutiny, headlines, and the inevitable target painted on his back by those who'd see him as a threat. Not pressing charges, though, that meant letting Bradley walk free, his badge intact, his arrogance unchecked, ready to prey on the next person who crossed his path. Darius's fingers tightened around the armrests of the chair, his knuckles paling as the weight of the decision pressed down on him. The lesson here wasn't just about Bradley's downfall, it was about the fragility of power. When wielded without restraint, Bradley had built his world on the shaky foundation of intimidation, believing his badge granted him invincibility. But in a single night, Darius had turned that illusion to ash, exposing the truth. Authority unchecked breeds its own destruction. Justice, Darius knew, wasn't just about punishment, it was about accountability. A reckoning for those who forgot that power came with a price. And as he sat there, staring into Gray's expectant eyes, he realized the choice he made next would define not just Bradley's fate, but his own place in a world that too often turned a blind eye to men like Bradley Hart. The city sprawled beneath a sky heavy with clouds, its lights flickering like the last gasps of a dying fire. Through the slats of Darius's apartment blinds, he sat alone, the weight of the day pressing against his ribs, his mind a storm of jagged thoughts. His phone lay silent on the coffee table now, but the echo of that earlier call still reverberated in his skull, a low, venomous voice slicing through the static. Bradley. The name alone tightened Darius's jaw until his teeth ached. He'd known men like Bradley his whole life, arrogant, drunk on the illusion of control, wielding power like a blunt weapon. But this time, something felt different. The threat hadn't just been words flung into the void. It carried a certainty, a shadowed promise that gnawed at Darius's resolve. He rose, restless, and stepped onto the balcony. The night air hit him like a damp shroud, thick with the scent of exhaust and rain-soaked asphalt. Below, the street stretched out in a muted glow, punctuated by the hum of distant traffic. His eyes scanned the familiar scene until they snagged on something unfamiliar. A figure, cloaked in shadow, leaned against a car across the way. The posture was unmistakable. Even from this distance, Bradley. Darius's pulse quickened, a steady drumbeat he fought to master. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just watched as the figure lingered. A silent taunt carved into the night. This wasn't over. It was only the opening move in a game Darius hadn't asked to play. Earlier that day, he'd stood in Gray's office, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and old paper. Gray, with his silver-streaked hair and calm, unyielding gaze, had leaned back in his chair, hands folded across his chest. "Take your time, Darius," he'd said, voice smooth but firm. "But be smart about this. You've got a career to protect." Darius had nodded, though his throat tightened with the weight of it all. He wasn't a fool who knew the stakes, years of clawing his way up, proving himself in a system that didn't always want him, could unravel with one wrong step. But backing down, that wasn't in him. Not then, not now. When his phone buzzed again as he left the building, he nearly ignored it. The number was blocked, a void staring back from the screen. He hesitated, thumb hovering, then pressed it to his ear. "Cole," the voice rasped, sharp and crackling like a live wire. Darius's stomach twisted, but his tone stayed even. "Bradley." Calling to apologize, a bitter laugh cut through the line, short and cruel. "I'm calling to warn you," Bradley hissed. "You don't know what you're stepping into." Darius's grip tightened on the phone, his knuckles whitening. "I know enough." Bradley's voice dropped lower, venom seeping into every syllable. "No, you don't. You have no idea who's behind me. You think I'm alone in this." The words landed like a fist, but Darius refused to let them shake him. "Are you threatening me?" Another laugh, colder this time. "You'll find out soon enough." Then silence seated, hollow silence. That night, As the city pulsed outside his window, Darius couldn't shake the unease clawing at him. Bradley's words weren't just bravado. They carried a weight, a hidden truth lurking in the cracks. He'd spent years battling men like him, bullies cloaked in authority, convinced their badges made them invincible. Darius had fought too hard, bled too much, to let that stand. But the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking his every move, clung to him like damp clothes. He stepped back inside, locking the balcony door with a sharp click that echoed in the stillness. Hours later, he found himself in his car, parked just beyond the glow of the police station's flickering streetlights. The engine had long gone quiet, leaving only the faint buzz of electricity overhead and the occasional rumble of a passing car. His hands gripped the steering wheel, the leather cool against his palms, his knuckles pale from the pressure. Across the street, the station loomed, an aging relic of cracked bricks and peeling paint, its windows glowing faintly like the eyes of a predator lying in wait. It wasn't the building that haunted him, though. The ghosts were inside, uniformed, badged, strutting through the halls as if they owned justice itself. His heart thudded, a rhythm he'd trained himself to tame, but tonight it rebelled, pounding harder with every passing second. He glanced at the dashboard clock, 10:47 p.m. The station was quieter now, its bustle reduced to a skeleton crew. Most officers had clocked out, retreating to their lives beyond these walls, but not Bradley. Darius could picture him slouched at his desk, that smug grin plastered across his face, the same one he'd worn days ago when he'd slammed Darius against the store counter. The memory burned, sharp and bitter, igniting a fire in his chest. Bradley had looked at him then like he was less than nothing, a speck to be crushed underfoot. Humiliation had seared Darius that day, but tonight he'd turn it into something else. The station's front door creaked open, and there he was, Bradley Hart, stepping into the night. Out of uniform, he wore jeans and a leather jacket that gleamed a little too perfectly, as if he'd polished it to mask the cracks in his confidence. His stride was all swagger, shoulders squared, eyes sweeping the street like a king surveying his domain. But Darius saw a subtle stiffness, the faint hesitation that hadn't been there before. He pushed his car door open, slamming it shut with a force that split the quiet like a gunshot. Bradley's head jerked toward the sound, their gazes locking across the asphalt. For a fleeting second, doubt flickered in Bradley's eyes, a crack in his armor, gone as fast as it appeared. He recovered, shoulders stiffening as he strode forward, voice slicing through the air. "What the hell are you doing here?" Darius didn't waver. He closed the distance, steps slow and deliberate, his expression a mask of calm. "We need to talk." Bradley snorted, but his hands twitched, betraying the nerves simmering beneath his bravado. "Oh, now you want to talk," he sneered. "You had your chance back at the store, but you didn't say a damn thing." Darius stopped a few feet away, his voice steady as stone. "You didn't give me time to talk, but I'm here now." Bradley's smirk faltered, though he tried to hide it. "You don't scare me," he snapped, but the edge in his tone betrayed him, as if he were convincing himself more than Darius, tilting his head slightly. Darius let his gaze harden. "I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to finish this." Bradley's face tightened, his smirk vanishing as his body coiled like a spring. "Finish what? You've got nothing on me." Without breaking eye contact, Darius reached into his coat pocket. Bradley flinched, muscles tensing as if expecting a blow. "Relax," Darius said coolly, pulling out a small flash drive and holding it up between his fingers. Bradley's eyes narrowed, his voice a sharp hiss. "What the hell is that?" Darius stepped closer, his tone low and unyielding. "Proof." Bradley's smirk returned, but sweat glistened at his hairline, betraying his unease. "Proof of what?" Leaning in just enough to force Bradley back a step. Darius's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Everything you've done. Illegal searches, false arrests, planted evidence. I've got records, reports, witness statements varying." Bradley's face reddened, but he stayed silent, his breath hitching. "And the best part," Darius continued, "it's all admissible in court." Bradley's bravado cracked. "You're bluffing," he spat, voice trembling. Darius's lips twitched, a faint, knowing smile. "You think your badge protects you? Think again. You're done." In an instant, Bradley lunged, grabbing Darius by the collar, his face inches away. Eyes wild. "You think flashing that badge makes you untouchable?" he snarled, spit flecking Darius's cheek. "No," Darius said, calm despite the grip on his shirt. "It makes me accountable. That's what separates us." Bradley's knuckles whitened, his rage boiling over. "You're going to regret this." Darius met his gaze, unflinching. "No, you are." Before Bradley could respond, the street erupted in flashing red and blue lights. He froze, hands dropping as he spun to see two unmarked FBI vehicles rolling up, their doors swinging open. Agents spilled out, faces stern and unreadable, their presence a cold wave crashing over the scene. Bradley stumbled back, panic flickering in his eyes. What is this?" Special Agent Mitchell Gray stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "It's over, Hart." Bradley's face drained of color, his bravado crumbling. "You don't know what you're doing." Gray's expression didn't waver. "We know exactly what we're doing. You've been under investigation for weeks, and tonight, you just added assaulting a federal agent to your charges." Bradley's panic ignited into fury as he whirled on Darius. "You did this." Darius stepped closer, his voice quiet but piercing. "No, you did this to yourself." Bradley turned to bolt, but two agents seized him, wrenching his arms behind his back. "You can't do this," he roared, thrashing against their grip. "You can't take me down." The sharp snap of handcuffs silenced his shouts, the sound ringing out like a judge's gavel. "You're finished," Gray said, his tone final as Bradley was shoved into the back seat of a car. Darius stood motionless, watching as the man who'd loomed so large in his life shrank into something small, broken, a shadow of the tyrant he'd been. The city lights pulsed around them, indifferent to the collapse of Bradley's reign. Gray turned to him, his voice softer now. "You okay?" Darius nodded, though his chest still ached with the weight of it all, not just the victory, but the lesson carved into the night. Justice wasn't a gift, it was a fight, and power, when twisted and abused, always carried a price. Bradley had learned that too late. Darius wouldn't forget it. Darius inclined his head in acknowledgement, though the frantic rhythm of his heart refused to settle, hammering against his ribcage like a caged animal desperate to break free. "It's not over." Gray's voice cut through the haze, steady and resolute. Darius's gaze dropped to the flash drive clutched tightly in his palm, its edges digging into his skin as if it held the weight of the world. "No," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not yet." The taillights of the car glowed red as it sped off, swallowed by the dark throat of the street, leaving behind an ominous stillness. Darius stood rooted to the spot, the cool night air brushing against his face. He could feel it deep in his bones. A storm was brewing, dark and inevitable, and he steeled himself for its arrival, knowing the consequences of this night would ripple far beyond the horizon. Meanwhile, Bradley sat slumped in the back seat of the FBI vehicle, the cold steel of the handcuffs biting into his wrists with a relentless, unyielding pressure. Each passing second seemed to tighten their grip, as though they were a physical manifestation of his unraveling life. The leather jacket he'd worn with such swagger just hours ago now clung to him like a second skin, damp with sweat that trickled down his temples in slow, humiliating beads. He stared out the window, the city lights streaking past in a dizzying blur of coloreds, yellows, and whites blending into a kaleidoscope of chaos. His mind churned, a whirlwind of disbelief and denial. This couldn't be real. Not to him. Not after all the years he'd spent carving out his dominion, brick by brick, in this neighborhood, drilling it with an iron fist, ensuring everyone knew their place beneath his thumb. And yet, here he was, powerless, trapped, his empire crumbling around him. "You don't have to do this," Bradley finally rasped, his voice raw and strained as he leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the partition that separated him from the agents up front. "We can talk about this. Come on, let's work something out." His plea hung in the air, desperate and fragile, but the agents didn't so much as glance back. "Hey," he barked, slamming his cuffed hands against the glass with a dull thud that reverberated through the confined space. "I said let's talk." Still, nothing, no flicker of acknowledgement, no hint of mercy. Defeated, Bradley collapsed back against the seat, his chest rising and falling in jagged, uneven breaths. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing his racing pulse to slow, but every time darkness enveloped him. Darius's face materialized, unshaken, a man who'd seen this endgame from the very start. The car lurched into a sharp turn, and Bradley's stomach twisted violently. He snapped his eyes open, catching the ominous glow of the FBI field office looming ahead, its lights piercing the night like the eyes of a predator. "No, no, no," he muttered under his breath, the words spilling out in a frantic, helpless litany as the vehicle rolled to a stop. The back door swung open with a harsh creak, and before Bradley could brace himself, two agents seized him by the arms, hauling him out into the biting night air. "Careful," he snapped, his voice cracking with indignation as he stumbled onto the pavement. "I've got rights, you know." The agent gripping his left arm didn't flinch, his face an impassive mask as he replied, "You should have thought about that before you tossed them out the window." They marched him forward, their footsteps clacking against the asphalt, through the heavy double doors of the building. The dimly lit hallways stretched out before him, each step echoing like the tolling of a bell, a relentless countdown to a fate he wasn't prepared to meet. Doors slammed shut in their wake, the sound reverberating through the sterile corridors as they dragged him deeper into the belly of the beast. Finally, they halted before a nondescript door. It creaked open with a groan, and with a rough shove, Bradley stumbled into the interrogation room. The space was suffocatingly small, its gray walls closing in around him like a tomb. A metal table, bolted firmly to the floor, occupied the center, flanked by a single chair beneath the harsh glare of fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. Bradley caught his reflection in the one-way mirror pale, wide-eyed. A man staring into the abyss of his own making. "Sit," one of the agents commanded, his tone flat and unyielding. Bradley hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of his situation, but a firm push between his shoulder blades sent him crashing into the chair. The cuffs clinked loudly against the table as he landed, the sound sharp and jarring in the oppressive silence. The door thudded shut behind him, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Time blurred minutes stretching into what felt like hours, the weight of the cuffs carving red welts into his wrists, every noisy hum of the lights, the muffled voices seeping through the walls pressed in on him, amplifying the dread coiling in his gut. Then the door swung open again, and Bradley's entire body tensed as dry as coal stepped inside. The air seemed to shift, growing heavier with his presence. Darius closed the door with a quiet click, his movements deliberate, almost eerily calm. He didn't sit, didn't approach the table. Instead, he stood there, arms crossed over his chest, his dark eyes boring into Bradley with an intensity that made the room feel even smaller. "What the hell is this?" Bradley spat, forcing bravado into his voice. Though it trembled at the edges, Darius remained silent, his gaze unwavering. "I said," Bradley began again, but Darius cut him off, his voice low and measured, yet sharp enough to slice through the thick tension. "You've said enough." Bradley swallowed hard, his throat parched, his defiance faltering under the weight of Darius's stare. "You have no idea what you're doing," he hissed, leaning forward as far as the cuffs would allow. "You think you're saving this neighborhood, protecting it. You don't get it, you never did." Darius's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something dangerous sparking within them. "No, you don't get it," he shot back, his tone steady but laced with a quiet fury. "For years, you've terrorized these people, bullied them, humiliated them, treated them like they were guilty of something before they even had a chance to breathe. And you think that badge on your chest gave you the right to play God? I was doing my job," Bradley roared, slamming his hands down on the table, the cuffs rattling violently. "Your job," Darius echoed, his voice rising for the first time, a crack in his composure revealing the depth of his anger. "Your job was to protect and serve, not to turn this community into your personal fiefdom because you thought no one would dare challenge you." Bradley opened his mouth to retort, but Darius pressed on, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You want to talk about order? Let's talk about the dozens of complaints filed against you, complaints that vanished into thin air. Let's talk about the fake reports, the intimidation, the people you threw behind bars without a shred of evidence, just because they didn't bow to you fast enough." Bradley's face flushed a deep crimson, his breathing growing ragged, but he couldn't muster a response. You didn't keep order, Darius continued, his words unrelenting. You sowed chaos and hid behind your authority while you did it. Bradley's chest heaved as he glared across the table. You don't know what it's like out there, he snarled, his voice low and venomous. Every day, surrounded by people who hate you, who'd slit your throat just for wearing the uniform. You think it's easy, you think it's clear-cut, it's noted survival. Survival. Darius's tone was icy, his calm restored, but no less menacing. You think that's what this was? Yes, Bradley snapped, his desperation boiling over. You think you're better than me, but you're not. You'll see this job. It changes you. Darius shook his head slowly, a faint, bitter smile tugging at his lips. No, he said softly, it reveals you. He leaned down, planting his hands firmly on the table, his face inches from Bradley's. And now, everyone's going to see exactly who you are. The words lingered, heavy and final, a guillotine poised to drop. Bradley's eyes darted to the mirror, his pulse pounding as he imagined the unseen faces on the other side, listening, judging. You think they'll believe you? He whispered, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and defiance. They already do, Darius replied, his tone unwavering. The door creaked open again, and Mitchell Gray stepped inside, his broad frame filling the doorway. It's time, Gray said, his voice gruff but steady. Darius straightened, stepping back as Bradley shoved his chair back with a loud scrape. His face drained of color. You can't do this, Bradley stammered, his bravado crumbling. You can't destroy me like this. Darius moved aside as the agents surged forward, seizing Bradley once more. You already destroyed yourself, Darius said, his voice soft but resonant with the weight of truth. Bradley's protests erupted into shouts as he was dragged from the room, his voice bouncing off the walls in a fading cacophony of rage and despair. Darius remained still, the silence settling over him like a mantle. He'd won this round, but the victory felt hollow, shadowed by the knowledge that the war was far from over. The hallway outside was oppressively quiet, the air thick with the scent of disinfectant and stale coffee. Darius leaned against the cold concrete wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest as he watched the agents lead Bradley down the corridor. The sound of Bradley's reluctant footsteps heavy, dragging Getchode until they dissolved into nothingness. Even then, Darius didn't stir. His mind was a tempest, adrenaline still coursing through his veins in sharp, electric bursts. But beneath it lay a deeper current relief, perhaps, though it was muddied by doubt and exhaustion. Mitchell Gray approached, his boots scuffing softly against the floor, his weathered face unreadable in the dim light. You did good in there, Gray said, his voice low and earnest. Darius didn't respond, his jaw clenched as he stared at the scuffed tiles beneath his feet. You don't have to carry this alone, Cole, Gray pressed, his tone softening with a rare trace of concern. You need to remember that. Darius exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound that carried the weight of his turmoil, and finally lifted his gaze to meet Gray's. It doesn't feel like it's over, he admitted, his voice rough with fatigue. Gray's brow creased, his eyes narrowing slightly. It's not, Darius continued, the words heavy with certainty. You know that as well as I do. Gray nodded slowly, his silence an acknowledgement of the unspoken truth. Men like him don't just vanish quietly, Darius went on, his gaze drifting back to the empty hallway. He's got friends, connections, people who think the way he does, who turned a blind eye to his abuses for years. Bradley was never in this alone. We'll deal with that, Gray said, his voice firm, though it carried the weariness of a man who'd seen too many battles. Darius's lips pressed into a thin line, his mind already racing ahead to the next fight. The lesson here wasn't just about Bradley's folly, it was about justice, raw and unyielding, and the consequences of power wielded without restraint. Bradley had built his kingdom on fear, believing himself untouchable. But the cracks had always been there, waiting for someone like Darius to pry them open. And as the echoes of Bradley's shouts faded into memory, Darius knew this was only the beginning, a stark reminder that true accountability demanded vigilance, not just victory. The storm was still gathering, and he would be ready when it broke. Darius moved forward with a steady, resolute pace, each step reverberating with purpose against the worn linoleum floor of the precinct. His brow furrowed as he shook his head, a mixture of frustration and urgency tightening his features. "We don't have the luxury of taking this slow," he declared, his voice rough with impatience. "This department's a rotting mess. We can't fool ourselves into thinking that lopping off one corrupt head will kill the beast." Across from him, Gray paused, his weathered face catching the dim light as he studied Dryas with a quiet intensity. After a beat, he tilted his head toward the small office tucked in the corner of the bustling station. "Come on," Gray said, his tone low but firm. "Let's hash this out inside." The door clicked shut behind them with a heavy thud, sealing them into the cramped, fluorescent-lit room. Gray settled into a creaky chair across from Dryas, the faint groan of the springs underscoring the weight of the moment. "I get it, Dryas," Gray began, his voice measured, carrying the gravelly edge of someone who'd seen too much. "I know what's eating at you." Dryas cut him off before he could finish, his words sharp and biting. "No, you don't." His eyes blazed with a restless fire, unwilling to be pacified. Gray didn't flinch. He held Dryas's gaze, unyielding. "I do," he countered evenly. "I know what it's like to crave justice so fiercely it gnaws at you. Keeps you pacing the floor when the rest of the world's asleep. I've felt that same helpless rage, staring at the corruption festering right under our noses, knowing it's a machine we can barely dent. And I've been where you are, wondering if one wound however deep could ever be enough to stop it." His words hung there, heavy with the weight of experience, a quiet plea woven into them. Dryas turned his head, breaking eye contact, his jaw tight as he wrestled with the storm churning inside him. Gray pressed on, his voice softening but resolute. "But you've got to know when to step back, even just for a breath. If you let this consume you, Dryas, it'll rip you apart piece by piece." Dryas leaned forward, elbows digging into his knees, his hands clenching into fists as he fought to keep his voice steady. "I can't just turn my back on this," he said, the words spilling out raw and unfiltered. "Not after what I saw tonight. You were there, Gray. You saw the way he looked at me, even with those cuffs on. That smug bastard doesn't think this is over, and you know what? I don't either." Gray fell silent, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest as he considered Dryas's words. Then he leaned back, the chair creaking again under his shifting weight. "You're right," he admitted, his tone shifting to something harder, more certain. "It's not over. But you're not fighting this alone. We've got solid evidence now, witnesses who'll talk. And Bradley, he's just the tip of the spear. There's more coming, a whole web of it, and I need you sharp for what's ahead." Dryas's jaw clenched tighter, the muscles twitching as he grappled with his anger. "Being sharp doesn't erase the truth," he shot back. "People like him keep slithering back, and this damn system keeps shielding them." "Not this time," Gray said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Dryas's eyes narrowed, skepticism sharpening his tone. "How can you be so damn sure?" Gray leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Because we're not letting this slip through the cracks, not me, not you. We're in this together." The words settled into the air, and for the first time that night, Dryas felt them take root, a fragile flicker of resolve piercing through his exhaustion. It wasn't the end, not yet, but maybe, just maybe, that was a fight worth having. Later that night, Dryas sat hunched in his dimly lit apartment, the soft blue glow of his laptop casting jagged shadows across the cluttered room. Papers and coffee mugs littered the table, the air thick with the stale scent of hours spent digging. The screen flickered as he scrolled through a maze of reports, case files, and not each one a thread in the tangled mess tied to Bradley and his ilk. His eyes, red-rimmed and burning, traced the patterns emerging from the chaos, complaints buried under bureaucratic red tape, evidence mysteriously lost, reports rewritten to protect the guilty. It wasn't just Bradley, it never had been. This was a cancer, spreading far beyond one man. The sudden buzz of his phone jolted him upright, the vibration rattling against the wood. An unknown number flashed on the screen, and a chill crept up his spine. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the button, then pressed it to his ear. "Cole," he said flatly, his voice betraying nothing. A pause crackled through the line before a familiar voice slithered out low, sharp, frayed at the edges. "I hope you're proud of yourself," Bradley sneered, his words dripping with venom. Dryas's grip tightened on the phone. "You're calling me from jail?" he asked, his tone cold. unflinching. "Don't get too cozy," Bradley hissed, his bravado strained. "You think this is the end. You think you've won." Darius leaned back in his chair, the springs groaning under his weight as he let a slow, deliberate breath escape. "No," he said, his voice cutting through the static. "I think this is just the start." Bradley's laugh came sharp and jagged, a brittle sound that cracked under its own weight. "You've got no clue what's headed your way," he spat. Darius didn't waver, his resolve hardening like steel. "I know exactly what's coming," he replied, each word deliberate. "Accountability for you, for all of you." Bradley's breathing quickened, a frantic edge creeping into his voice. "You're playing with fire." "Cole," he snapped, "you really think you can scrub this clean? You don't know the half of it." Darius's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then I'll learn," he said simply, unshaken. "You'll never stop us," Bradley snarled, his defiance teetering on desperation. "You'll never stop me." Darius leaned forward, his voice dropping to a razor's edge. "I already did." The line went dead, leaving a hollow silence in its wake. Darius stared at the phone, his pulse thudding in his ears, before setting it down with a quiet, resolute thud. 2 days later, the investigation exploded outward like a wildfire, licking at the edges of the precinct and beyond. More officers were dragged into the light. Names Darius knew, faces he'd passed in the halls, men who'd stood beside Bradley and turned a blind eye. The department reeled, a chaotic scramble erupting as brass tried to plug the leaks. Outside, the streets roared with life. Protests swelled in front of the station, voices rising in a cacophony of anger and hope, while reporters swarmed like vultures, their cameras flashing in the gray dusk. Through it all, Darius remained an anchor amid the storm, standing at his desk surrounded by towering stacks of files, his focus unyielding. Gray approached, his boots scuffing against the floor, a thick folder clutched in his hand. "You were right," he said, his voice cutting through the hum of the bullpen. Darius glanced up, his brow arching. "About what?" Gray dropped the folder onto the desk with a heavy slap, the sound reverberating in the cramped space. "This isn't just Bradley," he said, his tone grim. "It's bigger and uglier than we thought." Darius flipped open the folder, his stomach twisting as he scanned the contents. Grainy photos, redacted reports, a litany of names stretching far beyond the precinct. "This isn't a few rotten apples," Gray continued, crossing his arms. "It's the whole damn orchard." Darius exhaled slowly, the weight of it pressing down on him like a physical force. "Then we torch it," he said, his voice low but fierce. Gray's lips twitched into a smirk, a rare glint of amusement breaking through his stern facade. "Careful now," he warned, half teasing. "You're starting to sound like me." Darius shut the folder with a snap and met Gray's gaze, his eyes blazing with a clarity he hadn't felt in weeks. "No," he said firmly, "I'm starting to sound like me." As he turned back to the files, a certainty settled deep in his bones. This wasn't just about toppling one man. It was about dismantling a broken machine and forging something stronger from the ashes. But first, he had to see this through. The holding room buzzed with the faint, incessant hum of fluorescent lights, their cold glare carving stark shadows into the concrete walls. Darius stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor, each sound swallowed by the dull clang of the steel door slamming shut behind him. The air carried a sterile tang of disinfectant mingled with the metallic chill of confinement. But it was the suffocating tension that truly thickened the space. Bradley sat slumped at the scratched metal table, wrists bound in cuffs that glinted dully under the light. He looked diminutive, one surrogate frame sagging, shoulders hunched, his bloodshot eyes ringed with exhaustion. Yet when they snapped up to meet Darius's entrance, a flicker of defiance still smoldered beneath the weariness. "So they sent you," Bradley muttered, forcing himself to lean back with a bravado that didn't quite hold. Darius said nothing at first, his movements slow and deliberate as he pulled out the chair opposite Bradley and sat, the scrape of metal against concrete echoing in the silence. He set a file on the table unopened, a silent threat, and let his gaze settle on Bradley, watching the man squirm under the weight of the quiet. "I asked to come," Darius said at last, his voice calm but edged with steel. Bradley barked out a laugh, the sound harsh and splintering mid-breath. "Of course you did," he sneered, bitterness twisting his features. Couldn't resist playing the hero, staring down at the guy in chains. Darius's face remained a mask, unyielding. "Save it," he said, his tone flat but firm. "I'm not here to gloat." Bradley leaned forward, the cuffs clinking sharply against the table, his eyes narrowing. "Then why the hell are you here?" Darius held his stare, letting the question linger before answering. "Because this doesn't end with you." Bradley froze, the words sinking in. But he quickly masked it with a forced smirk that faltered at the edges. "You don't get it," he said, shaking his head. "You think you've won something, don't you? Like this is some neat little victory. It's not over. Not by a long shot." "I know," Darius replied, his voice cutting through Bradley's bravado like a knife. "That's why I'm here." Bradley's smirk slipped further, uncertainty flickering in his gaze. "Good," he said, his tone dropping to a venomous whisper. "Because it's not even close." Darius leaned in, closing the distance between them, his presence steady and unrelenting. "Then start talking," he said. "Tell me who's pulling the strings." Bradley hesitated, his shoulders tensing, a shadow of doubt crossing his face. "You don't want to know," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Yes, I do," Darius shot back, his patience thinning. Bradley's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, the mask slipped entirely. "No," he said, his voice trembling faintly. "You really don't." Darius's jaw tightened, his frustration boiling beneath the surface. "Stop playing games," he snapped, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "You're out of moves, Bradley. You want a shot at walking out of this alive. Talk." Bradley's breath hitched, his chest rising and falling rapidly as something raw broke through his defiance fear. Stark and unguarded. "They'll kill me," he whispered, the words spilling out like a confession. Darius didn't blink. "Not if you help us stop them," he countered, his voice steady but insistent. Bradley shook his head, a frantic edge creeping into his movements. "You don't know what you're up against," he hissed, his eyes darting toward the corners of the room as if expecting shadows to close in. "These people, they're not just cops, they're everywhere. Judges, politicians, people you'd never suspect." Darius sat back, the weight of Bradley's words settling over him like a storm cloud. But instead of fear, a quiet resolve took hold. This wasn't just a battle against one man's corruption, it was a war against a system that had grown fat on its own power, crushing anyone who dared to challenge it. And yet, in that moment, Darius saw the lesson carved into the chaos. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a fire that had to be stoked, a reckoning that demanded sacrifice. Bradley's abuse of power had been his undoing, a stark reminder that even the mightiest could fall when the truth refused to stay buried. For Darius, this was no longer just a case, it was a vow to see that fire burn until nothing corrupt remained. In the dimly lit confines of an interrogation room, the air hung heavy with tension, thick enough to choke on. Bradley's voice trembled as he spoke, a jagged edge of despair cutting through his words. "You think I was the villain here, Darius? You've got no idea. Green is the real monster." His breath hitched, and his eyes, red-rimmed and restless, flickered toward the shadowed corners of the room, as if expecting something or some Iannetto emerge from the gloom. Darius felt a cold knot tighten in his gut, a visceral confirmation of suspicions that had gnawed at him for weeks. He'd long sensed the rot ran deeper than Bradley, but hearing it aloud sent an icy shiver racing down his spine, pooling like dread at the base of his skull. "Keep going," Darius urged, his tone steady but laced with an undercurrent of steel. Bradley shifted in his chair, the metal legs scraping against the concrete floor with a sound that grated on the nerves. He leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly despite the cuffs binding them, and lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Green's the puppet master. He's pulling every string, planting fake evidence, twisting reports into whatever shape suits him, burying anything that might stick to him or his cronies. And the worst of it, half the department knows. Some of them even helped him build this filthy empire." His words spilled out like a confession, each one heavier than the last, as if he were unloading a burden he'd carried too long. Darius felt his pulse hammering in his ears, a relentless drumbeat urging him onward. "Names," he demanded, his voice sharp and unyielding. "Give me names." Bradley hesitated, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. He looked like a man teetering on the edge of a cliff, knowing one wrong step could send him plummeting. "Green," he finally rasped, "and Clark. But it's not just them. They've got tentacles everywhere, lures, city officials. A whole network of snakes slithering outside these walls. You think locking me up rattled them? Nah, it just pissed them off." His eyes darted to Dryas, searching for a reaction. But Dryas leaned in closer, his gaze unblinking, his presence a wall of determination. "Then give me proof," Dryas said, his voice low and dangerous. A quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. Bradley swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as if the words were stuck in his throat. "I can't, not yet," he stammered, and that was when Dryas's patience snapped like a taut wire. "Don't you dare play games with me, Bradley," Dryas snarled, his voice slicing through the stale air like a blade. "You don't get to sit there acting like you're still in control. That ship sailed the moment you got caught." Bradley flinched, his shoulders hunching as if the words had struck him physically. But there was a flicker of defiance in his eyes that refused to die. "You think I don't want to hand you everything," he hissed, his voice rising with a mix of fear and frustration. "You think I enjoy living like this, jumping at every shadow, waiting for them to slit my throat? They'll come for me first, Dryas. And if you keep digging, they'll come for you too." His words hung between them, a grim prophecy delivered with the certainty of a man who'd seen the abyss up close. Dryas didn't blink, didn't flinch. He met Bradley's gaze head-on, his own voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Let them try. I'm not backing off." Bradley shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips, though it sounded more like a sob. "You don't get it, do you? You're not just fighting one guy. This is bigger than Green, bigger than me. These people don't just ruin Livesey, make them disappear, like you never existed." The weight of his warning settled over Dryas like a shroud, but instead of retreating, he leaned back in his chair, letting the silence stretch. Then, with a quiet resolve that filled the room, he said, "Then we make sure they can't erase this." Bradley's shoulders slumped, defeat etched into every line of his face. "You'd better be damn sure about this," he muttered, "because once you start, there's no turning back." Dryas rose to his feet, his eyes locked on Bradley's. "I'm sure," he said, and the finality in his tone left no room for doubt. As Dryas stepped out of the room, the heavy clang of the door shutting behind him echoed like a gunshot. The hallway stretched before him, dimly lit and lined with peeling paint, a testament to years of neglect. The weight of what lay ahead pressed down on him, a burden that threatened to crush his resolve a bit. He squared his shoulders against it. This wasn't just about toppling Green or dismantling the network that sprawled like a cancer through the system. It was about justice, about clawing back trust in a world that had let too many people down for too long. Gray was waiting for him at the end of the hall, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his face a mask of guarded curiosity. "Well?" Gray asked, his voice gruff but steady. Dryas met his gaze. "We've got names, Green and others, but this isn't just a case anymore, it's a war." Gray's eyebrows arched slightly, but he nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "Then let's make sure we win it," he said, and Dryas felt the flicker of something like hope ignite within him. Later, in the FBI briefing room, the air buzzed with the faint hum of flickering fluorescent lights. The walls were a chaotic tapestry of corkboards pinned with photographs, maps, and strings that wove a web of corruption connecting names Dryas was only beginning to unravel. The faces staring back at him, cops, judges, businessmen, seemed frozen in time, their expressions smug or indifferent, oblivious to the storm gathering against them. Mitchell Gray stepped into the room, shutting the door with a soft thud that reverberated in the stillness. He carried a thick folder, its edges worn and creased, and his face bore the hard lines of a man who'd spent decades wading through messes no one else wanted to touch. He dropped the folder onto the table with a heavy thud, his voice low and measured. "It's worse than we thought." Dryas didn't look up immediately. His eyes lingered on a photo of Patrick Green, the man's sharp, angular features and piercing gaze seeming to mock him through the lens. "How much worse?" he asked finally, his voice flat but taut with control. Gray flipped open the folder and slid it toward him, revealing a cascade of paper smomos. Redacted files, names crossed out in thick black ink. They're onto us, Gray said. Green's already moving, shredding documents, torching evidence. 2 of our sources went dark this morning. I don't think it's a coincidence. Darius's jaw clenched, the muscles in his neck tightening as anger simmered beneath his calm exterior. They're scared, Gray added, watching him closely. Which means they're about to hit back. Darius leaned back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders a coiled spring ready to snap. Bradley warned me they wouldn't stop, he said quietly, his mind replaying the man's haunted expression. Gray snorted softly. Bradley also said he'd survive this. Look how that turned out. Darius pushed the folder aside and stood, pacing the room with restless energy. The floor creaked under his boots, each step a punctuation mark to his racing thoughts. We can't let them regroup, he said, his voice rising with urgency. If Green thinks he's still untouchable, he'll dig in deeper. We lose momentum now, and we lose everything. Gray crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing as he studied Darius. What's your plan? He asked, his tone probing but not dismissive. Darius stopped pacing and turned to face him, his stance resolute. We push harder, hit them where they're vulnerable, expose the connections they can't bury. But we do it smart, quiet. Green's dangerous, sure, but he's also cocky. He thinks he's above us, just like Bradley did. Gray raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. You sure you're ready to take that swing? Darius didn't hesitate. I've never been more ready. Gray nodded, but there was a shadow of caution in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the stakes. Then we'd better not miss, he said, and the words landed like a vow. The holding area was a cold, sterile box of a room, its walls stained with the ghosts of past interrogations. Bradley sat at the same scratched metal table, but he was a different man, no smaller, somehow. The bravado stripped away to reveal a brittle shell of fear. He didn't look up as Darius entered, his head bowed over his cuffed hands. But Darius didn't give him the luxury of silence. You were right, he said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a whip. Bradley's head jerked up, his eyes wide with a mix of surprise and dread. What? Darius sat down across from him, his gaze unrelenting. Green's moving, burning evidence. Cutting ties. He knows we're closing in. Bradley swallowed hard, the clink of his cuffs against the table a nervous tick. I told you, he said, his voice sharp but unsteady. You don't know what you're up against. Darius leaned forward, his tone a blade's edge. Then make me understand. Bradley's eyes flickered to the door, then back to Darius, his breath shallow and uneven. They don't leave loose ends, he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his own terror. That's what I am now, a loose end. Just like you. Darius's jaw tightened, but he held Bradley's gaze. Then give me something I can use. Help me take them down before they get to us. For a moment, Bradley wavered, his hands trembling as he weighed his options. You don't get it, he said, his voice breaking. Green doesn't play by the roulette, writes them. Arresting me didn't scare him. It made him bolder. Darius leaned closer, his voice dropping to a fierce murmur. You're terrified of him. Good. That means we're getting close. Bradley's eyes darted to the door again, and for the first time, Darius saw him crack completely. They'll come for me first, he muttered, his voice barely audible. They already have, Darius countered, his tone unrelenting. Bradley shook his head, a frantic edge creeping in. Not like this. Green doesn't let people talk. If I give you what you want, they'll make sure I never open my mouth again. Darius's voice softened, but it carried the weight of iron. They don't get to decide that, you do. Bradley stared at him, and something shifted in his eyes, desperation, maybe, or the faintest glimmer of resolve. I need protection, he said, his voice raw. You'll get it, Darius replied without hesitation. Bradley paused, then leaned in, his words tumbling out like a dam breaking. Green runs it all, but he's not the top dog. There's someone else, a Simeon, higher up. I don't know who. Green always kept that close. But I know this, whoever it is, they're not just shielding the operation, they're feeding it, growing it. Darius felt his stomach lurch, the implications sinking in like stones. Feeding it how? He pressed, but Bradley only looked down, his silence louder than any answer. The lesson here wasn't just about chasing down the guilty, it was about the cost of power unchecked. the way it warped everything it touched. Green and his shadowy overlord hadn't just broken the law, they'd shattered lives, erased them, all to protect their throne of lies. Justice wasn't a gift to be handed out, it was a fire to be kindled, a reckoning for those who thought they could wield authority like a weapon without consequence. And as Darius walked away from that table, the weight of the fight ahead settled deeper into his bones, a reminder that every step forward came with a price, but one he was willing to pay. In the cramped, dimly lit confines of the interrogation room, shadows danced jaggedly across the peeling walls, accentuating the suffocating tightness of the space. Darius leaned heavily against the icy edge of the metal table, his knuckles whitening as they pressed into the surface, grounding him amidst the storm brewing in his mind. Across from him sat Bradley, a man whose slumped posture and cuffed wrists painted a picture of defeat, though his restless eyes betrayed a flicker of defiance. Sweat beaded along his brow, catching the faint light as his gaze darted toward the door every few seconds, as though he could sense an invisible noose tightening around his neck. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, thick with the weight of secrets about to spill. "You said Green's cleaning house," Darius began, his voice a low rumble, steady despite the chaos swirling inside him. "What the hell does that mean?" Bradley shifted uncomfortably, the clink of his cuffs echoing in the stillness. He stared down at his trembling hands, as if they held the answers he was reluctant to voice. "It means he's not just hiding his tracks," Bradley finally muttered, his tone heavy with dread. "He's cutting off every loose end, people who might talk, evidence that could surface. Whatever is left, he's torching it." Darius's eyes narrowed, his mind racing to piece together the implications. "Torching it how?" He pressed, leaning closer, his breath sharp with urgency. Bradley lifted his head, his gaze piercing through the haze of fear that clouded his features. "Literally," he said, the word dropping like a stone. "Records, reports, anything that ties back to him, it's all going up in flames. And the people, the ones who know too much." He paused, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. "They're vanishing." Darius felt a chill crawl up his spine, his jaw clenching as the scope of Green's ruthlessness sank in. "And you?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Bradley's breath hitched, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. "I was next," he admitted, his voice cracking with the confession. "They'd already started circling," Mithrites whispered in dark corners, eyes following me everywhere I went. "I thought I could outsmart them, scare them off with bravado. But I was dead wrong. That's why I'm here, Darius." Darius's stare hardened, his mind flashing back to the moment Bradley had been dragged into this room. Not by choice, but by circumstance. "You didn't come to me," Darius corrected, his tone icy. "You got caught. Don't try to paint yourself a hero now." Bradley flinched, the truth stinging more than he cared to admit, but he didn't argue. "Fine," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it doesn't change the fact that I'm here, spilling everything. If Green finds out I've talked," Darius cut him off, leaning in so close their faces were inches apart. "He already knows," he said, his words a quiet thunderclap. Bradley's face drained of color, his eyes widening in terror. "What? You think Green doesn't have eyes inside these walls? You think this place is a fortress? It's a sieve, Bradley. That's why you're still breathing in this building. Move you too soon, and we're both finished." Bradley's hands trembled, his cuffs rattling as panic clawed at him. "So what are you saying?" "I'm trapped here." Darius's gaze didn't waver, his resolve stealing with every passing second. "I'm saying you need to give me something real, something I can use to bury Green. Now, because every minute we sit here, he's slipping further ahead." Bradley's shoulders slumped, his voice breaking as he spoke. "You don't get it. I wasn't high enough in the chain to see it all. Green's too clever, he keeps the top locked tight. But I've got one thing." Darius's pulse quickened, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What?" Bradley hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously to the one-way mirror, as if Green himself might be staring back. "There's a shipment," he said finally, his voice low and urgent. "Something massive. Green's been buzzing about it for weeks, dirty money flowing in. Payoffs to silence anyone who's wavering. He's tying up every loose end with this one." Darius leaned closer, his breath shallow. "When?" Bradley's gaze darted again, his reluctance palpable. "Tonight," he whispered. "Where?" Darius demanded, his patience fraying. Bradley shook his head, fear etching lines deeper into his face. "You don't need to know that. If you go after him, you're a dead man." Darius slammed his fists onto the table, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. Bradley jolted, his cuffs clanking as he recoiled. "Tell me where it is," Darius barked, his voice a raw command. Bradley flinched again, his resolve crumbling. "The docks," he rasped. "Warehouse 14, midnight." Darius stepped back, his chest heaving as adrenaline surged through him. "If you're lying," he began. But Bradley cut in, desperation lacing his words. "I'm not, but you've got to watch your back. Green doesn't gamble unless he's rigged the game. If he's there tonight, it's because he's already won." Darius didn't respond, his mind already racing ahead. He turned and rapped sharply on the door. It swung open instantly, revealing Gray, a weary agent with a calm demeanor that belied the storm they were walking into. "Get him out of here," Darius said without glancing back, "and keep him alive." Bradley's voice trailed after him as he left, faint but piercing. "You're walking into a trap, Darius." He's always 3 steps ahead. The docks loomed ahead, shrouded in an eerie stillness that felt like the calm before a hurricane. Fog coiled low over the ground, its ghostly tendrils weaving through the pale beams of overhead lights, while the distant rumble of a boat engine hummed like a heartbeat across the water. Darius crouched behind a rusted stack of shipping containers, his breath fogging in the chilly air as he scanned the shadowed expanse. His eyes locked onto Warehouse 14, its hulking silhouette stark against the mist. His fingers tightened around the radio clipped to his vest, the weight of the night pressing down on him. Gray's voice crackled softly through his earpiece, steady and measured. "We're in position. To teams east and west. Just give the word." Darius's grip on the radio tightened, his mind calculating every move. "Wait for my signal," he replied, his voice a hushed command. He edged forward, keeping low, his boots silent against the damp concrete. Near the warehouse entrance, a black SUV idled, its headlights dark, but a faint ember glowing insidious cigarette tip, betraying the presence of its occupants. 2 figures stood by the door, their outlines sharp and menacing in the fog, their casual stances belying the danger they posed. Darius's chest tightened, a mix of fear and determination surging through him. This was Etone's chance to strike at the heart of Green's empire. He pressed the radio to his lips. "Go." The night erupted into chaos. Agents poured in from both sides, their shouts slicing through the silence as flashlights cut through the haze. The men at the door scrambled, one reaching for a weapon, only to be slammed to the ground by a charging agent. Darius didn't hesitate, surging forward through the fray, his heart pounding as he breached the warehouse doors. Inside, the scene was a gut punch. Crates towered along the walls, their cryptic codes glinting in the dim light secrets sealed in wood and steel. Bags of cash sat in haphazard piles, their sheer volume a testament to the corruption they fueled. And there, in the center of it all, stood Patrick Green, unruffled and composed, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. His presence was a stark contrast to the chaos around him, his calm a silent taunt. "You're early," Green said, his voice smooth as silk as he turned to face Darius, a faint smirk curling his lips. "Drop it," Darius snapped, his gun steady in his hands, the barrel trained on Green's chest. Green's smirk widened, his eyes glinting with amusement. "You think it's that easy?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Darius's finger brushed the trigger, his resolve unwavering. "It is." Green shook his head, his confidence unshaken. "No, because even if you pull that trigger, this doesn't end. You can't kill the system, Darius. It's bigger than me, bigger than you." Darius stepped closer, his voice a low growl. "You're done." For a fleeting moment, Green's smirk faltered, a crack in his armor. Then the rear door burst open and agents flooded in, their weapons drawn. Green's hands shot up, but his gaze remained locked on Darius, unyielding. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his words a promise laced with venom. "It is for you." Darius shot back. As Green was hauled away, his tailored suit rumpled, and his composure fraying, Darius exhaled, the tension bleeding from his shoulders. But deep down, he knew the war was far from won. The courtroom buzzed with restless energy, a hive of anticipation as reporters murmured among themselves, their cameras flashing like fireflies in the packed space. Darius sat near the front, his posture rigid, his eyes boring into Patrick Green at the defendant's table. Green's tailored suit couldn't mask the strain etched into his featureless jaw tight, his hands gripping the table until his knuckles blanched. For the first time, the man who'd wielded power like a weapon looked vulnerable. Teetering on the edge of collapse, the judge entered, her presence commanding silence as the room rose to its feet. "All rise," the bailiff intoned, but Darius's focus never wavered from Green. The judge's voice cut through the hush, sharp and unwavering. "Mr. Patrick Green, you have been found guilty on all counts: conspiracy, obstruction of justice, racketeering. Your actions have inflicted deep wounds on this community, eroding the very trust that binds it together. For these crimes, you are sentenced to 30 years in federal prison." A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by a swell of whispers. Green's shoulders slumped, but he quickly straightened. Forcing a mask of calm over the panic flickering in his eyes, he turned slightly, his gaze locking onto Darius, his voice a hushed hiss. "You think this ends with me?" Darius didn't flinch, his response steady and resolute. "No, but it ends for you." Green's lawyer grabbed his arm, whispering frantically. But Green's stare lingered until the guards pulled him away, his silhouette vanishing through the door. Darius let out a slow breath, the weight of the moment settling over him like a shroud. Victory tasted bitter, tinged with the knowledge that the rot ran deeper than one man. Days later, Darius stood outside the precinct, watching as officers hauled boxes of evidence-centered files, encrypted drives, ledgers of illicit deals sent awaiting vans. The investigation had peeled back layers of corruption no one had anticipated. Judges trading rulings for cash, politicians pocketing bribes, private prison moguls profiting off packed cells. It was a sprawling web, more vast than even Bradley had hinted at, and now it was unraveling. Gray approached, his hands shoved into his pockets, his lean frame casting a long shadow in the fading light. "You did it," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We did it," Darius corrected, his tone weary but resolute. Gray offered a faint smile. "Sure you don't want a break after this?" Darius shook his head, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Too much left to do." Gray nodded, unsurprised. "What about Bradley?" he asked, his smile fading. Darius's gaze darkened. "He'll testify against the rest. His deal holds. But he's still going away witness protection after a long stretch." Gray shrugged. "Even criminals have their uses." Darius didn't reply, his thoughts drifting as another box was carried out. "This isn't over," he said finally. "No," Gray agreed. "But it's a start." In a small, stark cell, Bradley sat alone, his hands resting on his knees, fingers tapping a restless rhythm against the rough fabric of his jumpsuit. He'd traded one cage for another, this one laced with the faint promise of freedom years down the line. But the walls pressed in, a constant reminder of the life he'd lost. Footsteps echoed down the corridor as guards passed, their shadows flickering through the bars. But Bradley didn't look up. He leaned back, closing his eyes, his mind replaying the past days when he'd felt invincible, untouchable. Now that illusion was shattered, leaving him adrift, unsure of who he'd become. One memory burned brightest, Darius's unwavering stare, his voice a quiet vow: "It ends for you." For the first time, Bradley believed it. Weeks later, Darius stood on the courthouse steps, the sun blazing overhead as reporters swarmed, their shouted questions a chaotic chorus. He raised a hand, and the noise ebbed, their attention fixed on him. "Today marks a step forward," he began, his voice steady, carrying over the crowd. "Not just for this department, but for this city. Corruption festers in the dark, but it withers under scrutiny. What we've done here exposing lies, dismantling networks sends a clear signal. No one stands above justice." Cameras flashed, murmurs rippled through the throng, but Darius pressed on. "This is just the beginning. The fight continues, and we can't falter. Accountability rebuilds trust, and that's a duty we all share." He stepped back, ignoring the barrage of follow-ups, and descended the steps as the sun dipped below the skyline. That night, in his sparse apartment, Darius sat alone, the city's glow filtering through the window, casting long shadows across the room. His phone buzzed incessantly on the desk, but he let it ring, his mind full to engage. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a moment to breathe, to feel the weight of what he'd achieved. Green was behind bars, the system cracked open, but the victory was fleeting. More battles loomed, shadows waiting to rise. When they did, he'd meet them head-on, because justice demanded nothing less. This tale lays bare the raw power of accountability, a single spark igniting a blaze that consumes corruption, revealing the cost of unchecked power. Darius's relentless pursuit didn't just topple a man, it shook a system to its core, proving that the fight for what's right is grueling, perilous, and unrelenting. Yet it's a fight worth waging, a lesson carved in the ruins of Green's empire. Power abused breeds its own downfall, and justice, though slow, is an unstoppable force.